we'll wrap up calcium, magnesium for our macronutrients. So this is our fifth and sixth respective nutrient that we will deal with right now. And you'll see as we move through here, we didn't spend nearly as much time with sulfur as we did with some of the NPK. Calcium, magnesium will spend even less time, and then we get to the micros and they'll be even less. So um, calcium, magnesium will be treated kind of together because they have a lot of parallels. There are differences, so I'll kind of compare and contrast the differences as we go through this. So again, here's our kind of basic overview where we've got calcium and magnesium both taken up primarily by plants in their ionic form of calcium 2 plus, magnesium 2 plus. Again, these are cations, they're base cations or basic cations, okay, like we've already talked about. The primary form or major source rather is through the soil minerals, and calcium typically represents maybe 2.5 times the concentration of magnesium in plants. So maybe about 0.5% for calcium and maybe 0.2% on average for magnesium. So the difference in terms of concentration in plant carries through to the total concentration in soil. Calcium anywhere between 0.1 to 5% of the total mass of soil. Magnesium 0.1 to 1%. And then the exchangeable, not just the total amount in the soil, but the exchangeable. So there's much more exchangeable calcium than mag in soil. Typically 50 to 85% of calcium. The exchangeable sites is calcium, then anywhere between 5 and 35% magnesium. Okay, so both of these nutrients primarily move through to the roots through mass flow, but also root interception to some extent. And then a major difference is that calcium is an immobile nutrient. That is, it's going to show up in new tissue first, those deficiency symptoms, where magnesium is going to show up as a mobile nutrient. And just like NPK, it's going to typically show up deficiencies in older plant parts before newer plant parts. They do serve different functions in terms of plants themselves, and there is some overlap in terms of a plant can use one or the other because they're both these divalent cations. They're two charged, 2 plus cations. So calcium is important in terms of cell division and elongation. We often think of calcium in terms of the role it plays for cell wall structure and the permeability, regulates cation uptakes, enzyme activities, starch metabolism. So there's a number of different, like most nutrients, there's a number of different mechanisms or processes that they play. Function of magnesium in plants. Really, when we think about what magnesium does, one of the primary roles is it is a constituent of the molecule chlorophyll. So, and that's maybe up to 20% of the total mag in plants is really in this chlorophyll. So that's a large percentage. Here we see a structure of chlorophyll where we've got magnesium and then surrounded by 4 nitrogens, okay? And then the rest essentially of different carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Well, that might not seem like much, but again, when we think about we talked in the very beginning of this course that plants are mostly carbon dioxide and water, right? They're vast majority, 95% or greater, typically, of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. That's really what they are. So this structure is actually very both nitrogen and magnesium rich. Magnesium also plays a role in the structural component of rhizomes. So this is, of course, that site when DNA is getting transcripted and it's, essentially replicating. And so, and it's the site of, the rhizomes, are the site of where protein synthesis occurs. And so when we have a lack or a deficiency in magnesium, we have a compromised ability of that plant to actually produce protein. So, or produce structurally intact protein. So it compromises the ability to synthesize protein. And it also is involved in ATP and energy transfer. So compromise in that is going to compromise photosynthesis, glycolysis, respiration. So very primary and fundamental cell processes. Calcium deficiency is very uncommon in Ohio, but can occur in highly leached or unlimed acidic soils. I already mentioned that calcium is immobile, so it's going to occur in kind of the younger plant parts. Rot on the end of tomatoes and melons, this blossom end rot, is often associated with calcium issues, okay? And calcium deficiency prevents emergence and unfolding of leaves, and maybe some poor nodulation. So, just some pictures. Here again, this was grown in hydroponic solutions, and you see some of this necrosis and chlorosis that's happening with calcium. In my illustrious career at Ohio State, I have not seen any calcium deficiency to date. Magnesium deficiency, again, so it's a mobile nutrient, older in plants. Very characteristic that it's got this intervenal chlorosis, so it's typically across the whole leaf where we say the veins are green, but in between the veins it might be chlorotic or yellow, and sometimes even necrotic if it turns that bad. So you will sometimes see these in soybeans or other crops. Sometimes we've suspected in corn, although never really truly confirmed if that was it or not. So it can happen. And then just showing you again this, I've shown you this many times at this point, but thinking about this dichotomous key of young leaves versus old leaves, NPK and magnesium are essentially mobile nutrients, and that's why they are all lumped together in here, and then calcium is over with the immobile nutrients, okay? Here's our calcium-magnesium cycle. Even the Haviland textbook kind of lumps these together because these nutrients behave very similar. And so we have residue, manure, biosolids, going into this organic form that might feed into the solution, fertilizer, lime, etc. There's plant uptake. There's leaching that occurs of cations. And then we have adsorption, desorption with exchange sites on the soil colloid. We have primary minerals, secondary minerals, weathering processes that makes the calcium, more and more, and magnesium more and more available, and ultimately able to be desorbed into soil solution. But again, this is a much more simplified process than many of the cycles that we've talked about today. Here's, again, just what I just mentioned, the additions, the transformations, and the losses that are kind of spelled out in bullet form. And then thinking about availability, what makes calcium and magnesium available? Well, a lot of it has to do with the total supply. So how much, are on these exchange sites, for example, and then if that's enough to supply the plant needs, right? So some of that will be driven by soil pH, of course. With highly acidic soils, there's going to be a lot more aluminum and hydrogen on those exchange sites, occupying those exchange sites. CEC, higher CECs are typically not, they're going to have a much greater capacity to hold calcium and magnesium, and so typically we would assume lower CEC soils would be the first to have issues if there were issues. And then again, these two concepts are related: CEC or percent calcium or magnesium saturation, the type of clay, and then the ratio to other ions. So there's a number of things, but a lot of these are of course interrelated. Predicting calcium magnesium deficiency. Soil tests are the most reliable and recommended tool for predicting calcium magnesium deficiencies. Tri-State recommends that we have greater than 200 part per million calcium and greater than 50 part per million magnesium. And these are both very low bars. It's depending on the soil, et cetera, but it's very rare to have either a calcium soil test come back or a magnesium soil test come back at these levels or less. I mean, typically, depending on the CEC, they can be 10 times these levels here. For sources, our main calcium source that's applied is calcium carbonate. Of course, this is agricultural lime. It's about 40% calcium. We just talked about gypsum, calcium sulfate, 23% calcium. And then there's a whole bunch of chelated calciums that are sold as foliar products. Much more expensive, targeted typically for specialty crop applications, okay? There's also calcium that comes in a number of other fertility sources, things like triple superphosphate, although we don't really use a lot of that anymore. It's kind of actually pretty difficult to get, but some parts of the world it's still a primary phosphorus source. Things like calcium nitrate can be used, of course, primarily in specialty crops. Rock phosphates and manures, all these things are, they contain other nutrients, but also calcium. Magnesium sources. There's ag lime, which is calcium carbonate, and then there's dolomitic lime. And dolomite or dolomitic lime is calcium magnesium carbonate. Okay, so it's got magnesium in here. There's langbonite, which has got potassium sulfur, magnesium sulfur. So it's these like potassium sulfate, magnesium sulfate complex. Epsom salt is a neutral salt, so this is like analogous to gypsum. Mag sulfate versus calcium sulfate is gypsum. So this is Epsom salt. Like from when you were a kid, maybe you'd soak in the bathtub with Epsom salt, right? Lime, dolomitic lime raises pH. Epsom salt is a neutral salt, so it does not raise pH. Mag chloride, mag nitrate, manures, different magnesium sources that are out there. And one thing to kind of think about, we typically do not think about managing calcium or magnesium in Ohio, at least the soils that we have. If we are managing pH, these are issues that are typically not problematic. One of the only issues, or I should say, one of the more common issues that can happen is applying potassium in excess amounts and then driving, because the potassium is of course a base cation, it can compete for exchange sites with calcium and magnesium. Applying too much K, over-fertilizing with K, can cause a couple of different things. So it can cause grass tetany, and that's when there's a low magnesium uptake in forages, and essentially we have ruminant animals that are eating that have a manganese deficiency for themselves, for the animal and not for the plant. So the plant's fine, but the ruminant livestock have issues with that. Okay, this can be both high rates of ammonia or high rates of K fertilizer can lead to grass tetany. And then there's also what's called milk fever, which is again typically from the same issue of over application of ammonia or potassium and driving calcium off those exchange sites. That causes calcium uptake in the forage to be less than it might otherwise would be, and then milk fever as a result. So both of these are kind of like livestock ruminant nutrition issues caused by either too little magnesium or too little calcium in that feed material. They can, of course, be easily remedied with like salt licks or supplements, but if they're not managed actively for that, then you might run into issues. And so these are again not say plant deficiencies, but animal deficiencies that would be related to grazing and hay production. Okay. Aside from these, we don't really think about. We're not often not adding calcium or magnesium explicitly to kind of manage nutrition, but we're going to talk about a special case scenario of that next.